Welcome back, everyone, to Preaching Through Second Peter. I'm Pastor Michael John from the Market Street Baptist Church here in Amesbury, Massachusetts.
I'm Kevin Leach. I'm the pastor at Woodland Presbyterian Church in Woodland, Washington.
Okay, and we are back in chapter 2 again, and we've really slowed down here, but we're about to finally finish this paragraph. Chapter 2, verses 1 to 10. We are focusing on verses 6 through 10 today. So why don't we read the whole passage once again, and then we'll kind of do a quick review and then hit our section beginning in verse 6. So Kevin, would you read that for us here?
Well, now the last 2 weeks I've read it, so why don't
All right,
you?
I'll read it for us. But false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing upon themselves swift destruction. And many will follow their sensuality, and because of them, the way of truth will be blasphemed. And in their greed, they will exploit you with false words. Their condemnation from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell, and committed them into chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly, and if he rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked, for as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. Well, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials, and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment, and especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passion and despise authority. So, Kevin, why don't you give us a little recap then of what we've covered up to this point so far in that paragraph, verses 4 through 10.
Okay. Well, again, I think I said this last week, but verse 3 kind of lays it out for us, just to remind us that that though it may not seem like this in our eyes, that destruction is reserved for the wicked, the ungodly, those who choose not to follow God, and the destruction is coming. It's not asleep. And so Peter's making this very clear because we can think that it's never going to happen, like that psalmist in Psalm 73. But he wants to remind us. So he gives us these examples that we find the if-then statements. And so he gives us those 3 examples with 4 if statements. And then finally ends with then in verse 9, then the Lord knows how to rescue. So he gives us these scenarios where the wicked are judged, the righteous are preserved and delivered. And if that's true, then we know it's true now that the Lord knows how to rescue the godly, and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until that day when he comes again, which is the focus of chapter 3.
Yeah, absolutely. Now he gives a few analogies for us to. This is all about false teachers, all about false prophets.
Yeah, and that's really important to remember. We can lose that sight.
We have to always bring it back to that the false prophets and teachers, he's comparing them first to these fallen angels who sinned, who rebelled, and were punished for that. He compares them to the ancient world in the days of Noah, which we discussed last week, and how they were condemned and the flood wiped them away. Now he compares them to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and how they were destined for extinction, turned to ashes. And then he sets up Lot as a model for us, a righteous Lot. The idea, I think, as I'm reading this, is I want to be more like Noah and less like the ancient world. I want to be more like Lot and less like Sodom.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about those 2 things here. What was Sodom and Gomorrah like? What was that about? What's that story? And we can pull back to Genesis for that. And then we'll talk about why Lot is considered righteous. What's so good about this guy?
Yeah, well, we remember Lot and how he got to Sodom and Gomorrah in those cities down in the plains, where that was the point at which Abraham and Lot, they were growing in terms of their herds and all that. And so Abraham said, we shouldn't dispute with one another. So let's choose. And Abraham says, you choose whichever place you want. and I'll take the other. And of course, Lot looked down upon the valley and saw how good it was. It was well watered, it was green and lush. And so he, of course, chose the cities of the valley, where it would be his dwelling place. And Abraham went the other way.
Yeah. And it's noteworthy that when Lot looks to the Jordan Valley and sees this area where Sodom and Gomorrah is, before they're destroyed, it's the only place that I could find in scripture that is compared to the garden of the Lord, meaning the Garden of Eden. That's noteworthy, that this area that is chosen, Sodom. So don't think of Sodom and Gomorrah as some filthy, rat-infested inner city ghetto, but rather more like Paris in the spring, or just a vacation destination, maybe even Acapulco or Puerto Vallarta or something like this. Something the Love Boat would go to Sodom and Gomorrah if it was around. If we remember.
And when we imagine these cities, we imagine the best about them, and not really thinking about the worst about them, right? So when we think of the big city in lights, and I think of Paris, or a place I'd love to go is Rome.
Yeah.
And so what am I thinking of when I think of Rome? Well, I'm thinking of, these incredible structures and of course, like you said, the lights and the activity and people want to be there. You want to go there and visit.
Lot chooses to go there. Lot wants to go there, and he lifts up his eyes. He goes there, and then at the end, he even moved his tent as far as Sodom.
Yeah.
So he goes. He finds himself in these cities. And again, they're cities because people want to live there.
Right.
If when people want to live in a town, the town becomes a city because it's popular. That's the whole point of it. It's a lot of people live in this place. They're not forced to live there. They live by choice because it's something very attractive about it. Now, the other part here is it mentions, so we have this glorious place, Sodom and Gomorrah, that is just the envy of the Near Eastern world there. The Jordan Valley, prosperous, abundance. And then it says, but the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. Now, before the incident that we're going to discuss in Genesis 19, what do we know about their wickedness, and what made them such sinners against the Lord? What was really their problem?
Well, certainly, I'd say that they were a people who were probably very prideful in terms of what they had. I mean, you live in a place like that, you've got it all. So you think of how when we have affluence, what happens to us?
Yeah,
I know when I'm very affluent. I mean, I live in a land that's affluent, and it's very easy for me to stray from the Lord. Yeah. I don't depend upon the Lord anymore. I don't think of the Lord, when we get so caught up in our affluence. We think we have it all. And I would say that that's probably the sin that we're talking about, that wickedness.
It really is. The original sin is pride. I mean, it's the sin of the devil in the garden. We're told that. Ezekiel has some interesting reflections on these passages.
Yeah.
So like in Ezekiel, I think it's 28, the prophecy against the prince of Tyre, and it compares him to the devil you were in Eden, the garden of God. And then he goes down further and he speaks to the problem with him. Your heart was proud because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. And so there is this, that's where it begins. It always begins there. The fall of Babylon. What's Babylon called before it falls? It's called Babylon the Great. The glory of Rome, all these places. And in Sodom particularly is very interesting. I think it's Ezekiel, I think it's 16. Yes. In down around verse 48 and 49, he says, let me get this bigger here. What's going on? Here we go. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. That's the beginning. They were haughty.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we begin with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Their real sin was not the sexual immorality they're about to perform or trying to perform in when Lot is there. which we're going to read in Genesis 19, but really their pride is at the heart of their wickedness.
Yeah, you mentioned that last week. You mentioned that passage in, help me out here. Now it slipped my mind, but now it's shown me, oh man, what is good and what the Lord requires of you. And and that's what it's speaking about. It's speaking about the humility, walking with the Lord, doing justice. You know, here's the problem. It says in that Ezekiel passage, in Ezekiel 16, it said, you were pride and you were filled with pride. You had all these things and you did not take care of the poor.
Yeah.
You didn't have mercy. You didn't show justice.
Yeah. And that's what pride does, doesn't it? You're so consumed with yourself that the other people around you are, they're objects to be used.
Yeah.
And to cast aside. There's no concern. If you cannot do something for me, I have no interest in you. And so there is this callousness, this insensitivity, not that they were even abusing the poor per se.
Right.
They didn't care. They did not care.
Right.
So,
and that brings us, you know, back to we've been talking about false teachers and how often do we see that same thing in false teachers? They are using people for their own needs.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just watched the first episode of the Hillsong documentary on Discovery Plus. It's on the Hillsong, the Exposing a Megachurch, I think it's called. But one of the stories I was hearing about it was how the pastors of the church were celebrities, and they had a green room where they would go and relax and be away from their fans, and they could indulge themselves and hang out together. And then they had these other people that they would hire. All these volunteers were doing the hard work in the church, getting paid nothing. Yeah. And sometimes if they did get paid, it would be like, you know, minimum wage, $6 an hour to watch the kids do your chores for you. And so they live these lavish lifestyles, these pastors, these men of God, living these lavish lifestyles, while the people that are making everything work, that are running everything, are being either doing it for free because they're told that this is their service to the Lord, or they're getting paid, you know, peanuts, and they're treated like the way that celebrities treat their staff and their fans, like trash. They're not important. I'm the important one. And Sodom and Gomorrah is like that. It's a celebrity culture there.
And you know, you compare that to what the Apostle Paul says about his ministry. Yeah. You know, they came and they didn't want to take anything from the people because they didn't want to be accused of anything. And that, you know, here's Paul who's using his trade as a tent maker, and because that's how he supported himself. You know, so what a difference between that and the false teachers. Yeah,
it really is. And again, we have to, you don't learn the lesson of Sodom and Gomorrah unless you understand how attractive it is, this place, how alluring it is. If you know the scene that you're going to see in Genesis 19 is not attractive, it's ugly, but that's not how Sodom presents itself at the beginning. It becomes that, but at the beginning it's glorious, and it turns into depravity, and God basically brings this glorious Garden of Eden to ashes. Talk about complete distinction. Now I think Sodom and Gomorrah would be in the region, if not in the Dead Sea itself. Do you know about what they expect about it is?
Yeah, I mean, it's in that southern part of the Dead Sea, where the Dead Sea was. It was interesting. I can't remember who it was. It might have been Josephus, and something in something that Clement wrote, but talking about in their time there was still evidence of the cities that were there. Which is, you know, whether or not that's true, I don't know.
It's interesting, very interesting. So let's take a look at the Genesis 19 passage where we have this scene. So the scene is that Lot is in Sodom. In chapter 18, God had visited Abraham. The Lord had visited him with 2 angels. So there are 3 men that came to Abraham. And then the 2 men head off to Sodom. And basically God tells Abraham, I'm planning on destroying Sodom. And if these reports are true, of course, God knows whether they're true or not. But the point is that, you know, he doesn't just judge people on what he knows of their hearts, but he gives evidence for the judgment to show that his judgment is just. So he sends the two angels over to Sodom, and Abraham then pleads, if we remember, for them and says, if there's just a few righteous people, would you spare it for the sake of the righteous people?
Yeah.
I think he gets God down to 10, if I'm not
Right.
mistaken.
He does. Yeah.
There's just 10 righteous people. Won't you spare the city? And the Lord says, yes, I will. But unfortunately, he can't find 10. He can barely find one. So the two angels come to Sodom, and it's an interesting path. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but we go through it. They come to the place and they're going to sleep in the square, which in a normal city, they would be fine to do that, but not here. And so Lot begs them to come in with them and takes care of them, feeds them, treats them the way that Abraham treated them.
Yeah.
Before, as he's really compared to Abraham in this. But then before evening, the men of Sodom sniff them out somehow. And verse 4, young and old surround the house, and they call to Lot, "We're the men you came to you tonight. Bring them out to us that we may know them." And that's not kind of like a getting acquainted, sort of knowing how you're doing, where you're from.
Yeah.
This is a sexual thing, and they're seeking to rape them, basically.
Yeah.
And that all the people to the last man, that's crazy.
Yeah. Can you imagine that? So word gets out in this city.
Yeah.
And it just spreads like wildfire till the
in a
whole
few
city.
hours, a mob forms because of these two men. Now, it might be that they're strangers, but it might be that they are being angels. They were probably very glorious beings. They may be glowing, or they might be doing something here, but there's something special about these men, them, that makes them desirous of this attention.
Yeah.
So Lot comes out and begs them to not act so wickedly. And he says, "I have two daughters. If not, let me bring them out to you and do them as you please. Only do nothing to these men." I think the point is with this is the desperation, the torment that Lot is in over this. And I don't know if, there's some suggested that maybe he's bluffing, that he's just trying to find a way out of this, buy him some time.
Yeah.
That maybe he knows these men would not, do anything to the daughters because they belong to the city or whatever it is. I don't know, but or just the hospitality code that you do whatever you can to protect.
Right.
Lot is not the one on trial here. The point is that he's desperate to make this stop, and their response to him is, "Stand back. You're just a sojourner. Now you're a judge. Yeah. We're going to deal with you worse." And they pressed hard against the door, and the men reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house and shut the door. So the angels save Lot.
Right.
And then they blind everybody, and even blind, they're still groping for the door.
Yeah.
This is so defiling, so depraved. Any normal person watching this is like horrified.
Yeah.
Horrified at what is happening here.
Yeah.
I imagine that it is probably the shock of when the Germans were forced to go and visit the concentration camps, the Auschwitz and things, and look at what has happened. Look what your glorious country is really about.
Yeah.
The shock of this glorious city. This is the real heart of them being revealed now. And then he brings them out. And so the rest of the story is Lot. The men say to Lot, "We're out of here. We're destroying this place. I'm not even going to bother to see if there's anybody around." That's right.
Yeah.
And Lot basically tries to get his sons-in-law who were to marry his daughters to come out too, but they think he's joking. And so the angels urge Lot, "Take up your wife," and he's lingering. He's just, you can imagine the confusion. He's trying to get things going.
Yeah.
He sees him and his wife and his two daughters, and they pull him out. And of course, ends up that Lot's wife looks back and turns into a pillar of salt, looking back longingly for this. She's from Sodom. We're assuming that he probably met her there. That would have been her home. And that's the end of the story there. And so Lot is delivered, and fire and sulfur rain down on Sodom and Gomorrah. So we'll come back to our text now. So Kevin, the question I think everyone is asking is, Peter says that Lot is righteous.
Yeah, not just once, 3 times.
But twice, 3 times?
Three times. There's the third time is speaking about his.
Yeah.
Yeah, third time. Yeah.
3 times. That righteous man, righteous Lot, his righteous soul. 3 times.
3 times. And that is really not the picture that we tend to get when we're reading these stories about Lot, especially when we see that he's living in this wicked city. That later on, the story with his daughters and how they, get him drunk and all that.
Yeah.
So we don't tend to think of Lot as a righteous man.
Yeah, I was always taught that you don't want to be like Lot.
Yeah.
That he's selfish, remember? Because
Yeah.
Abraham gives him the choice of the land and he chooses the better one, right?
Yeah.
Goes of the east there, and then he's living among them, and clearly he's a total loser. He marries an evil woman or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And then his 2 daughters are crazy, and then you get the whole thing of the offering them to the Sodom people.
Yeah.
There's just, I was always, whenever I heard sermons about Lot, it was always, you don't want to be like this guy. He's just the worst.
I was just came across something. I think it was in a commentary, but basically describing Lot, he is the carnal Christian. That's the way he's described.
Yeah. That's the way.
I just don't think that's the right way to, and especially in light of this passage. What makes him righteous? And I think there's some clues here for us. And as I was talking to you earlier about this, I really think that what Peter is doing is he's setting up Lot, because we're like Lot in a lot of ways. Why are we here in the midst of the wicked world with surrounded by unrighteousness? It's because of our sin, and that's the same thing with Lot. It's he's there because of his sin, and that's like us in the world, and yet we are called to be set apart, just like Lot is. I think Lot's set apart. Yeah. And it's very clear. He is disturbed. It says he's continually tormented.
Yeah.
By their rebelliousness and wickedness.
Yeah, absolutely. Peter, again, does not present Lot as a carnal Christian at all. Mm-mm. And he sets him up as an example, just as he did with Noah before.
Yeah.
He says, this is, just as Noah was for the ancient world, that's how Lot was in Sodom and Gomorrah. He's not one of them. He's a righteous man. What makes him righteous? Well, we would say first thing is same thing that made Abraham righteous.
Right.
It was his faith. He believed the Lord.
And it was credited to him as righteousness. Yeah.
For all his, we can say he was stupid. We can say he was foolish, but he believed the Lord.
Yeah.
And so when these angels come, look at how he treats these angels when they arrive. He treats them as well as Abraham did. Yeah. He feeds them and takes care of them, protects them. He's the only one who takes care of them, brings them in, and even risks his own life to save them. Imagine the courage it would take to go out to that mob and to tell them to stop. That's give him credit. That's bold. I'm not sure that many of us would do that.
Yeah.
So he really stands apart. But he believes the word. So when the angels say we're going to destroy the city, he believes them, and we know he believes them because he's trying to convince his family to get out of there. And he's lingering, not because he doesn't believe them. He's lingering because he's trying to get others to come with him.
Yeah.
They say there's no time. There's no time.
Yeah.
So he believes them. So his faith makes him righteous. But also, as you mentioned, his hatred of evil, that his torment and distressing that he is not one of them. He doesn't fit in. They even call him a sojourner among them. Mm-hmm. And he's never really a citizen of Sodom, even though he lives there.
Yeah.
He's not one of them. And that's very clear in the text. And I think that's the takeaway for us. I think with any good model, you're going to find, dirty laundry and things you shouldn't emulate. Same thing, even with Abraham. There are things that he did that we shouldn't be like doing either.
Yeah.
But the things that he did right is absolutely his faith and his torment and hatred of the evil that he was living in.
And I would add to that, remember, Peter's writing to a group of people, some of whom probably have been listening to these false teachers and have even started to stray. Mm-hmm. And he's sending a warning. He's calling them back, and he's saying, using Lot as an example, that we're to remember the righteousness of Christ. That's how he starts out. and that you're a part of God's family because of the righteousness of Christ, and that be like one who is seeking after the Lord, and so that you're trusting in the Lord so much that it's credited to you as righteousness, just like Abraham, and just like Lot here. And so it's a message that rings true for those who are feeling as if, they're living in a land of evil and there's just no way they can fight it. There is.
So the lesson we see is that Sodom and Gomorrah are these glorious cities turned to ashes. For all their fame and glory, they are turned to ashes. They're defiled and destroyed. Meanwhile, righteous Lot, for all his weakness, he's never accepted. He is held in contempt. He is tormented. He's an old man. Even his own family doesn't listen to him. He is delivered and brought into life. And that's the point. Again, coming back to, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials. That's what he did to Lot. He rescued him from these trials, and how he keeps the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment. And we saw that with Sodom and Gomorrah. He keeps them under punishment. There's a sense in which their own defilement is their punishment, and then ultimately their destruction, which is the lesson for us all, especially those that are indulgent in their lusts and defiling passion and despise authority. So let's come now to our application here. So that's the story, a brief overview of Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah. What are the lessons for us in relation to false teachers in the church from this section?
One of a couple of points that I have is the first, that remember where we dwell, that we're dwelling in a land, in a world of wickedness and deceit, and that we can expect that we're going to suffer the same kinds of temptations that we see Noah faced and Lot faced, that we are going to oftentimes be in the minority. And we are going to, we live in times where the celebrities are, or the champions are celebrated. And the false teachers are living in that way to receive that, the adulation, the praise. And we're not to fall for that. We've got to remember that, in our church, when I came here, I discovered that they have some, like every church has favorite hymns. And one of their favorite songs here is a song that I didn't really know. It's a country gospel song. And it's "This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through." Well, there's a real significance to that, that we need to remember that. And that would be one of the things that I would, we need to be careful, because what the false teachers want us to believe is that we need to be attached to this world. If we're going to have happiness, there's nothing wrong with enjoying. And that's not to say that we shouldn't enjoy life, recognize it as a gift that God has given us, but not to obsess.
So I would say, with that, I would say, beware of the cool and the celebrity. That's what Sodom and Gomorrah would have been. That's celebrity, that's cool, that's wealth, it's the fame. And some tests that I found to be, I try to look for quick, easy tests and rules of thumb to kind of give some guidance to things. And from my experience, it's been one of, when I see a pastor or a teacher presenting himself with like perfect hair and really fine, tight-fitting clothing, and he's really in good physical shape, nothing wrong necessarily about any of those things, but with that whole package together, that gives me a red flag. And the funny thing is, it's designed to not give me a red flag. It's designed to make me want to be with him. But if you understand the scriptures, when you see that, you're like, whoa, that's a red flag, because it's clear that this person and this ministry cares mostly about appearances and spends a lot of time on making sure people think of them in a certain way, in an attractive way. That's a warning. Now, I'm not going to say that that they're definitely a false teacher just based upon that simple judgment.
It's not 100%.
but maybe it's 99.5%. So, so it's so often. And I've seen this so many times. I remember seeing guys who were like, I remember meeting a pastor. I think we both know this guy. You know, he one of the most handsome men I've ever seen.
Yeah.
Perfectly tanned and
Oh,
coiffed,
yeah.
and beard perfectly. Everything was perfect. And to find out later on that he had to leave the ministry because of an affair.
Yeah. And that was quite
Um,
a shock. Yeah.
yeah. And so some of the things like with Hillsong, you see that with that documentary, you see that they're all about that image, and the pastors are wearing designer clothing. And there's a little Instagram post of preachers in sneakers. Have you seen this?
Yeah.
You know, showing, you know, the pastor's wearing these sneakers, and then he looks up the price of them, and they're like $3,000 for
Yeah.
these sneakers. So this is that is a giveaway. That's a tell. That this is like, you're dealing with Sodom and Gomorrah is attractive. Yes, it's attractive. But for the true ministry here, that's a warning to us, because
Yeah.
that's what the false teachers. Remember, Jesus told us that, beware, woe to you when everyone speaks well of you, because that's how they did the false prophets. They spoke
Yeah.
well of them. They're always popular.
Yeah.
They're celebrities. The other rule of thumb I have is that anytime I hear celebrities fawning over a preacher or pastor or teacher, it's a given just about every time that this is a false teacher, someone I'm going to be greatly disappointed with soon enough. I saw it so many times, because celebrities are not allowed to fawn over people telling the truth of the gospel.
Yeah.
They only fawn over those who will promote the message of the world.
Yeah, the winners, it's like like you mentioned last week, you know, the giants of the land. They're great reputation, right? Yeah. And that's who you want to be connected to.
Yeah. So like last time I said, you know, in Noah's story, I think in my mind, the help for me is that the false teachers are politicians in the pulpit. In Sodom and Gomorrah, I would say the false teachers are also celebrities in the pulpit.
Yeah.
They really are an appealing group, and that, but it works, and they grow their churches very large because of that. But we have to be careful. We have to be very careful with this, and notice that.
And that would bring me, you know, to my second point. Remember where you live, but also remember, or remember where you dwell, but also remember how we're to live and where we dwell. You know, this is where I think Lot stands out. I think is a great illustration. For he was tormented by the wickedness around him. And if we're not tormented by the wickedness of this world, then there might be a problem.
Yeah.
And I think that's really, you know, again, brings us back to the message that that Peter gives us in the first chapter. Yeah. You know, that we're to see these qualities and even increasing in us. And they're the qualities that are so different from the qualities that this world would celebrate. So. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think this quest for holiness is essential for us as a church. And that's one thing you won't really see in a lot of the church. John says in his letters, he says, how do you test these things? How do you know? He says, don't you know that if he is righteous, then those who are born of God are practice righteousness. Yeah. And that the one who practices sin is of the devil. Yeah. That's pretty simple. You know, so you have there is this quest for holiness to add to our faith righteousness and goodness and godliness and self-control and love. That's essential for all these things. Now, for me, I think one of the probably the big lesson, the final word I would say is for this passage is the big warning is not just for these churches with false teachers, and it's for us, and that is that pride is the problem. Yeah. And that's something that we're all vulnerable toward. Sure. Is falling into pride. Yeah. That's the danger, and that's what makes us compromise. That's what makes us adapt to the techniques of the false prophets. Even though we might not be a false prophet, yet we'll use their techniques because they work. Yeah. And we, in our pride, and that pride comes before destruction. We've heard it so many times. Right. And we've seen it so many times. Yeah. And to really warn against it. And for me, it's like, as I look at a church doing what they're supposed to be doing, we have I love Michael Horton's book, Ordinary. He really kind of rails against the those who are trying to be radical, trying to be, great for Christ. It's like there's an ordinariness about the Christian life that's not something you boast about.
Yeah.
And one of the things I think the ordinary church, the faithful church, does is attend to the means of grace, the apostles' preaching of the gospel, prayer,
Yeah.
fellowship,
Sacraments.
sacraments, breaking of bread. These are humble things we do.
Yeah.
And especially those, that the gospel is that Christ Jesus came to save sinners, of whom I'm the worst.
Yeah.
And so that if I'm really preaching the gospel, if I'm going to be faithful, I need to be like Lot in being greatly distressed over my own sin and crying out with Paul, what a wretched man I am, who will save me? That's what the gospel is all about.
Yeah.
Not about me attaining my dreams and visions and, ambitions in this life. It's about me crying out for a savior.
Yeah. You talked about a book, Ordinary. I'm going to talk about a book that I picked up this week because of this sermon, is Hole in Our Holiness by Kevin DeYoung. Really great. It's short. It's just 120 pages.
Oh, nice.
But it's a really good reminder to us, because I'm afraid in the church, we are tempted to just not even think about holiness, because we feel like it gets too close to this idea of working for our salvation.
Yeah.
And that's a real mistake. And that's why Peter is telling us, make sure that these virtues, you're adding to this virtue and godliness and all those things he mentions in chapter 1, 5 through 7. And we are
making every effort to do those things too.
What's that?
Making every
effort. Yeah. And so, I really encourage us to think about holiness in terms when we talk about righteous lot.
So that's great. So I think we've finished the paragraph here. We can break it here. Actually, that one sentence that took us 3 weeks to get through one sentence here, Kevin.
Yeah.
So we're going to take a few weeks off for Easter break, and then we'll come back and we'll try to get into the next paragraph, 10 to 16. But until then, we'll say goodbye and thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
All right.
Or in a few weeks, I should say.
Okay.